So welcome back to another episode of Doctor, We'll See You Now, the podcast where we explore the human side of creating technological change in the NHS. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that we have Professor Ian Abbs, former chief exec of Guy's St Thomas and champion and advocate of digital health for as long as I can remember, joining us here in the studio to talk a little bit about his life, his career, the state of the NHS today, and how we move forward in the digital ecosystem going forward. So Ian, welcome.
First of all, thanks very much for having me at Doctor, We'll See You Now. Fantastic to be here. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about.
There is a huge amount to talk about. And I suspect through your career, you've seen all sorts. You've probably seen a few cycles repeat. For those people who are listening who don't know you, can you tell us, in your own words, a little bit about your journey right from the beginning, from medical school? How did you get interested in medicine? How did things start?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Tom, I guess, that was quite a long time ago. And but thinking back, I was always interested in sciences and started to think about sort of medicine as I was coming up to my A-levels. One of the reasons I think I thought medicine would be quite interesting was that I'd read and seen quite a number of the films and that sort of thing called Doctor in the House. It was a kind of series that ran in the sort of 60s and 70s. And that was my kind of idea, really, of what medicine would be like. I didn't come from a medical family. And so I had a rather probably what you might describe as a sort of rose-tinted view of what medicine was like. But I started at medical school, met a fantastic group of friends who stayed with me until today. And then sort of post-medical school went into clinical practice, mainly in hospitals, started to become interested in particularly how organs, when transplanted, either were accepted by patients or rejected by patients, and therefore went into renal medicine with a particular focus on transplantation. And then over time went through sort of training and then became a consultant at Guy's Hospital in the mid-1990s. Actually, the great experience I did have, given the one of the main kind of drivers into medicine was believing in the Doctor in the House books, is that I did have a great friend, a trainee, in fact, at the Whittington, who invited me to her birthday party, which I went to, and there was a sort of pretty sort of happy man wandering around pouring out glasses of wine for people. And I recognized in his kitchen there were a whole number of Doctor in the House posters.
Right.
And I rather sort of naively said to him, goodness me, you like Doctor in the House even more than I do. And he kind of smiled and laughed and said, yes. And then I wouldn't drop it really. I said, I really think, because it was the period when Dirk Bogarde was playing the main character. You must really like Dirk Bogarde because you seem to have so many pictures of him. And he went, yes. And then I kept going in the same vein, really. And then realized that he was the author of the Doctor of the House books, a guy called Richard Gordon. But then I had the great advantage of saying to him, do you know what? It's nothing like. So to a certain extent, I was able to say to him that some of the things that I'd expected out of medicine were not quite the same as he portrayed them in those books from the sort of 1960s. But it has been, for me, a fantastic journey. I've absolutely loved my career in clinical medicine, mainly for the patients I've looked after, for the colleagues I've worked with. And I absolutely loved clinical practice. But there came a time, I suppose, after I've been a consultant for 6-7 years, when I started to think about the way that services were organized.
Yes.
And that's when I started to think about career alongside that of clinical practice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So trained in London, Guy's Hospital in the 1990s, and I'm sure there's some sort of link between kind of your interest in transplantations and whether or not they get accepted, and change management, and the realities of putting digital systems into hospitals. I suspect there's something in.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Tom. I mean, there's something about my first degree was in immunology.
Yeah.
So about how complex biological systems work.
Yeah.
And then I started to think about the way that organizations work in the same way that perhaps the human body works. Again, it's systems biology. And then how do you change the way that systems work? I've often thought about my later time in management and ultimately in leadership, and looking after organizations in the same way that you look after patients.
Yeah.
In the same way that a human has a particular type of physiology, anatomy, and sadly sometimes a pathophysiology that leads to disease. I think organizations in many ways work the same. Organizations have an anatomy.
They do, yeah.
They have a physiology. They have a system of the way that the organization works. And unfortunately, sometimes they have a pathophysiology. They don't work well. Yeah. And then very often trying to understand what is going on in an organization requires you to do the same diagnostic process as I would have thought I did caring for patients. And sometimes you can examine, think about an organization, examine it critically, and then come to a diagnosis. Because if you can come to a diagnosis in organizations, as you can come to a diagnosis in people, then that gives you a chance of changing things, to mend it, to actually cure one of the problems. And so I think there is something similar between the way that you manage organizations and the way that you manage people. I've always been very interested in digital.
Yeah. So before we get on to digital, so you're 6 or 7 years in, you decide, okay, then maybe there's another track for you here. Are you unusual amongst your peers? Are other people thinking that too?
I think it is unusual to go into sort of organizational management as a doctor, as a clinician, really. In fact, there are probably more nurses and allied health professionals in management roles than there are doctors. It is unusual, but unusual in the UK, because if you go to other countries around the world, US or Australia or continental Europe, you'll often see more doctors in management roles. And in fact, in the large academic centers in the US, it would be unusual for that to be run by someone who wasn't clinically and probably medically qualified. So there is something different between the ways that different countries have developed. When I was very interested in looking after patients, one of the metaphors I've sometimes used, which certainly helps me think about it, there are lots of clinicians who are very, very good at improving what they do on a daily basis within a relatively narrow field.
Yeah.
So certainly in hospital practice, I'd almost make that analogy to perfection in the sort of ploughing of a single field. So each row becomes increasingly a better ploughed row. So people are always searching for excellence in the thing that they do, and they have a laser focus on that. And I hope I had a pretty good focus on that when I was in clinical practice. But I started to get interested in, okay, so we're ploughing this field this way. What if you look into the next field? Are they ploughing that field better? Or in fact, is what they're doing worse than what we do? And what are the reasons behind that? So I started to get interested in comparison, really, between both different services within an organization and the same services between organizations. And how do you learn from the best to improve what you're doing yourselves? And then started, and actually there are a number of clinicians who do that. So you'll get people, for example, who are looking at clinical director roles who are running reasonably sized parts of organizations who will who will look over the wall and particularly do the comparison between organizations for improvement. And then there's a smaller number who think, well, operations, even ploughing or in a farm context or running a service in a healthcare context, it only works in the context of the total organization. Yeah. So you can have a very good, you could be ploughing a very good field and doing good things for patients, but ultimately it's unlikely if the organization around you is barren. It's unlikely that field, good though it is by itself, will be sustainable. So all service operations happen within the context of the greater organization. And so a few people, including me, are and have been interested in how whole organizations run. So eventually I moved to running larger parts of the organization in the early 2000s. It was interesting at that stage, and we may come on to talk about this, but that was in the first wave of what are known as foundation trusts, which in the early years of the Blair government after 1997 had more autonomy for decision-making, more autonomy for the boards of those organizations, including decisions on investment, on financial management, and on retention of surpluses. And that was a strong incentive, particularly for the organizations I was working in then, particularly Guy's and St Thomas's, which was a first wave foundation trust, to continuously improve its services. I went into running a larger part of the organization, particularly around specialized services, by the mid-2000s, and then went through a number of roles, ultimately to start as the medical director and then chief medical officer at Guy's and St Thomas's in 2011. And then I became the chief executive of Guy's and St Thomas's in 2019 and stepped away just recently.
Yeah, and I'm really interested to explore that kind of late 2000, that sort of, that point from CMO to CEO and that step. I think we first met in about 2015, so you were CMO then, and I remember sort of having my eyes wide as I met you, Ian. Going back to the 2000s, so Guy's and St Thomas merger had happened before the FT status. Just a little bit of history for those people that weren't around.
Yeah, so Guy's and St Thomas's, based in London, Guy's on the south bank of the Thames near the southern tip of London Bridge near to the Shard. St Thomas's on the south bank, one end of Westminster Bridge, opposite Parliament. Interestingly, going back in history, they'd always been strongly linked, both geographically and through history, by being next to each other in North Southwark. Guy's Hospital actually having been built on St Thomas's Street, St Thomas's being on the other side of the road. St Thomas's moved from its site in Southwark to the site opposite Parliament in the 1860s, when the hospital was built partly through subscription when Florence Nightingale came back from the Crimea. And although they had been strongly linked in history, there's quite a strong rivalry that developed between Guy's and St Thomas's through the early part of the 20th century, such that by the time the 1990s, they were actually quite strong and competitive rivals. Yeah. And the decision that ultimately came from things like the Tomlinson report on the future of teaching hospitals in London led ultimately to a decision for Guy's and St Thomas's to merge.
Right.
And they were feeling strongly held.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Around what that would look like. And the decision also to merge was taken in the early 1990s. And although those opinions strongly held prevailed for a little bit of time. Actually, I think once through the merger itself, over time, I think the different constituencies of Guy's and of St Thomas's came to realise that, in fact, the organisation was stronger together. This must be about 1997. Under the Blair government, the foundation trust models began in the early 2000s. And by that stage, Guy's and St Thomas's had some pretty visionary leadership, a very strong chief executive and a guy called Jonathan Michael, and a very strong board led by Patricia Mobley, I think, at the time, and went for early recognition as a foundation trust. And you needed to demonstrate a certain quality of operational quality and financial performance. And at the time, the people worked hard for that recognition. And from that recognition came this sense of autonomy and that we were accountable for our own future. One of the things that had characterized Guy's and a bit later St Thomas's was clinical leadership, was the formation of something called the clinical director model, which is where you have a clinician, usually a doctor in the Guy's Thomas's model, who was fully accountable and remains, in fact, that model still works today, is fully accountable for the quality, operational performance and financial performance of the services that they run. And that clinical leadership combined with a strong organizational leadership, I think, was one of the reasons that Guy's and St Thomas's was successful, plus the coming together during the merger, because that gave us a degree of scale.
Yes. And a tricky thing to have managed by whoever the leadership was at that point.
Yeah, because there certainly was a sense of rivalry and uncertainty about what the outcomes could, partly to do with what was suggested at the time to be hospital closure. But certainly the organisation in that sort of mid to later 2000s period grew quite rapidly. And it was one of the periods when not only did the services grow, but the physical estate grew as well. And so we built a number of buildings, including a new children's hospital, amongst others. And so there was a sense of momentum.
And in that period, so we're in the middle 2000s now, pre-Blair, long wait lists in the NHS. I remember the newspaper headlines. And then the NHS did a phenomenal job of cutting through those, but was relatively flush with cash.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, the sort of performance improvements were significant during that period between about 2002 to 2008, and as that was the period when often patients were waiting 2 years for heart bypass graft, a long time, for example, for routine hips or knee replacements. But two things happened at that stage. One was, you absolutely rightly say, Tom, was a significant injection of resource.
There was money.
So, in relative terms, the resource envelope grew by about 6% per annum per year over about a 6-year period.
Okay.
So that was an unprecedented moment of financial and other resource growth within the NHS. And that was coupled with tight performance management of targets. And I have I think targets do produce certain types of behaviors.
Absolutely.
And you can, coupling resources with a particular type of target, you can incentivize and induce change. So, and I think we certainly saw that during that period. And you saw waiting lists fall quite significantly. Now, it is possible, and we also saw some downsides of particular types of incentive models in that period, particularly around incentivization of particular types of financial performance, which might have edged out, and we certainly, without going into details now, it's certainly in some organizations edged out the quality conversation.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that focus on financial turnaround may have contributed to some of the very, very sad outcomes that we saw for some people during that period. But I think in general, and certainly for the organization I was working in at the time, that combination of autonomy and freedoms of decision making, the ability to grow services, particularly those that were enabled by an increase in resources, and then the ability to reinvest, retain surpluses into future service, it became a virtuous, in my view, a virtuous circle.
Yeah.
And it did at the time have the patient at the center, because remember that was a moment really of almost trying to bring into what had been a great but a service organized, I would say, more around organizations than around patients, a real change in the conversation about patients at the center, and really trying to focus on the patient experience and the patient outcome as a core part of the foundation trust movement.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense. You give an organization agency, you incentivize it well, and hopefully the patient and consumer experience kind of follows as part of that. So we manage the waiting lists. It's now the mid 2010s. Your CMO. Where does this interest in digital health come from?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I have to take you back quite a long way, actually, Tom, because so my father was an engineer,
right?
And he came out of the war. He was in the electrical and mechanical engineers, and he came into what was the developing UK computer industry.
Okay, cool.
So his first roles there were for a company that eventually became International Computers Limited, ICL.
Yes.
Which was, and certainly through many decades, the preeminent UK computer industry. It was an industrial leader. And this
is when computers were, you plug stuff in and you had punch cards, and they were mechanical as much as they were electronic.
So he came out of having been in the desert mending tanks into building computers from the components that you mentioned, Tom. So they were effectively hand built, and these are developments on the sort of Turing bomb and things like that. So he was building computers for ICL from scratch, and I remember going with him once to one of the sites that had a very state-of-the-art mainframe, which was about the size, in my memory, and I was about 5 or 6 at the time. In my memory, it was the size of a house. I mean, it was enormous.
Yeah, it probably was.
And I remember my father saying, "Would you like to get inside?" So I thought, "Oh, yes." So he opened a little hatch in the side, a little door.
Yeah.
And I walked into I probably crawled in, actually.
Yeah.
Crawled into the center of the computer and sat with the computer running.
Wow.
And in those days, this will date me a bit, but in those days, one of the variable resistance models were achieved in mainframes by the presence of valves, which were effectively light bulbs that had effectively a filament and with different resistances. And so as current flowed through this massive computer the size of a house, the light bulbs went on and off with varying intensity. And so to my infant mind, I was in the center of a star cluster.
Amazing.
So I was hooked.
Yeah.
From that, so I was hooked on technology really from that period.
You can't do that with an iPad, can you?
It's difficult to. So I don't know how many other people. I expect there are some, but how many people could say I've been inside a computer?
Yeah, not many.
So that was quite an important early experience for me. So I've always been interested technology, but technology for a purpose. And I had sort of an early understanding or an early belief that technology was going to change the way that we did things in many places. Actually, another interesting experience when my father went to work on the development of clinical computing
Did he really?
King's College Hospital in the 1970s.
Wow. Okay.
And it's actually interesting if you are a sort of historian of medical technology.
Yeah.
So they built a mainframe at King's that had many of the capabilities that we see in current hospital computer systems.
Well, I mean, when was Epic founded? 79?
Yeah, so late
Something like
70s,
that,
yeah.
Right?
Mid-70s, a mainframe computer, but with terminals on umbilical
Wow.
cords,
Okay.
effectively.
So computers on wheels are,
so
pretty modern compared to the sort of...
Yeah, but you could theoretically they had an experimental sort of ward set up with a mainframe, computers on carts, but connected to the mainframe, that you could enter the history and details of a patient.
Yeah.
You could enter lab results, and then you could call them up. So it was the early form of an electronic medical record, but on a mainframe. It was interesting at the time because that project came to an end more to do with culture than it did to do with technology.
And that sounds a lot like today.
And it's interesting to reflect, as I'm sure we will, on what is different today to what we experienced, what was experienced then. Because culture killed the program, not the inadequacies of the technology.
Yeah.
Because they were starting to do things like rudimentary drug interaction alerts and things like that.
Yeah.
And one of the things was the clinicians at the time, the doctors particularly, said, well, we're not here to enter, we're not here to type.
Yeah. I don't want to log into another system.
I don't, it was countercultural.
So interesting.
To the way that clinicians, particularly doctors, particularly consultant doctors, worked. And so that program came to an end. But I was always struck by those two experiences at the sort of either end of my sort of developmental period, really, because I remember going to see my father when I was in my later teens at KCH in Denmark Hill. That early experience of sort of getting into a computer and saying, this is incredible technology. Yeah. But then at the end of my teens, seeing actually that some of the limitations on technology are human cultural, not technical. And that I'm sure we'll come back to, because that has been an interest of mine over time. But I certainly saw in my early life, and of course, as well as those technologies, I started, I was in clinical training, to start seeing the elucidation of the sort of gene sequencing that now is seen as being relatively standard technology, but again, was an amazing transformational piece of science. What's interesting now is that we stand on the threshold of a new period in science, technology, and medicine, which is this convergence of the revolution in biology around the elucidation of the gene and gene sequencing, and the data and AI revolution, and particularly that what you might describe as digital biology now, that convergence of these two areas, which for many years were completely separate. I think it's a new era.
Well, one of the things I was most struck by on a recent trip to America was how AI is changing drug discovery. And it speeds up that process. It changes the way that the pharma companies are thinking. They're all building labs in Silicon Valley, which are all simulation labs. But it's that ability to go and build personalized molecules around an individual's needs, which, as you say, is going to completely change the way that we the way that we live, and hopefully we'll deal with some of the systemic challenges like antibiotic resistance and all these things that we worry about.
I think that's spot on, Tom.